In the crisp autumn light of All Saints' Day, 1755, Lisbon awoke to the sound of church bells ringing across a city that believed itself blessed by God and fortune alike. The Tagus River glittered under a clear sky, its waters carrying the wealth of an empire that stretched from Brazil to the coasts of Africa and India. Candles flickered in every home and cathedral, honoring the saints, while families dressed in their finest clothes made their way to Mass. No one suspected that within the hour the ground beneath their feet would betray them in ways no living soul had imagined. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly, on a morning that smelled of incense and roasted chestnuts, in a city whose golden age had already begun to tarnish at the edges. Portugal, in the mid-18th century, stood as one of Europe's proudest maritime powers, its capital, a glittering hub of trade, culture, and Catholic devotion. Lisbon's population neared 200,000 souls, crowded into narrow streets lined with Manueline palaces, ornate churches, and warehouses heavy with colonial riches, sugar, gold, spices, and slaves. The royal court under King Joseph I enjoyed the opera in the newly built Opera do Tejo, while merchants haggled in the Baixa district and fishermen mended nets along the riverfront. Yet beneath this surface of imperial confidence lay the invisible fractures of a society that had grown too comfortable with its own myths of divine favor and unshakable stone. The earthquake that would soon strike was not merely a natural disaster. It was the moment when an entire civilization's illusions about order, faith, and permanence began to crack. Daily life in pre-quake Lisbon pulsed with the rhythms of faith and commerce. Housewives lit candles before dawn, shopkeepers opened stalls filled with imported silks and Brazilian woods, priests chanted Latin in cathedrals whose bells told the hours. Children played in the squares, while noble carriages clattered over cobblestones, and the smell of baking bread mingled with the salt air blowing in from the Atlantic. Families gathered for the solemn feast of All Saints, unaware that the very buildings sheltering them had been raised without a single thought for the restless earth beneath. The architecture, beautiful and heavy with carved stone, had survived smaller tremors in centuries past, but no one had bothered to study why the ground sometimes shook, or how to prepare. Routine felt eternal, and that illusion of safety was the first invisible warning sign. No one understood what was coming next. Early tremors had whispered across Portuguese history. Quakes in 1356 and 1531 had damaged walls and frightened the faithful. But each time the city rebuilt, and prayed harder, convinced that God's mercy would always prevail. A Sebastianist prophet had even foretold destruction on All Saints' Day, 3 years earlier, yet his words were dismissed as the ravings of a fanatic. The Portuguese elite, steeped in Enlightenment ideas filtering from France and Britain, preferred to believe in reason and progress, while still clinging to the rituals of the church. No one mapped fault lines or reinforced foundations. No one imagined that the Azores' Gibraltar transformed fault, hidden far out in the ocean, could unleash forces capable of erasing a capital in minutes. By the time the signs became clear, it was already too late. The pressure beneath the sea had been building for centuries, invisible and unstoppable. Rising tension had been mounting not only in the earth, but within Portuguese society itself. The empire's vast wealth masked growing dependence on British trade and mounting debts from colonial wars. King Joseph preferred music and hunting to governance, leaving real power in the hands of his ambitious Secretary of State, the future Marquis of Pombal. Aristocratic families resented the rising influence of this commoner, while the church guarded its privileges fiercely. Lisbon's crowded lower town, the Baixa, sat on soft alluvial soil that would prove catastrophically unstable, yet no engineer had questioned the wisdom of building there. The city's daily rhythm continued unbroken, but beneath the surface, economic strain, political intrigue, and a complacent reliance on divine protection created the perfect conditions for systemic failure when nature finally struck. Key decisions, or rather the absence of them, sealed Lisbon's fate long before the first rumble. No earthquake-resistant codes existed. Churches rose taller and heavier to glorify God, their candlelit interiors packed on holy days. The royal family attended Mass that morning in the Church of São Vicente, while thousands filled other sanctuaries across the city. At precisely 9:40, On the morning of November 1st, the system began to fail. The ground heaved upward in 3 violent jolts lasting nearly 6 minutes, splitting streets into fissures 5 meters wide, toppling palaces and cathedrals as if they were made of paper. Stone walls crumbled, roofs caved in, and the air filled with the deafening roar of masonry grinding against itself. By the time the shaking stopped, 85% of Lisbon lay in ruins, and the collapse had only just begun. The moment the earth stilled, a new horror ignited. Candles knocked from altars during Mass set fire to wooden interiors and tapestries. Within minutes, a firestorm raged through the rubble, its heat so intense it asphyxiated people 30 meters away. Survivors staggered through choking smoke, searching for loved ones, only to hear the sea suddenly withdraw from the Tagus River with a strange sucking sound. 40 minutes later, the first tsunami wave slammed ashore, racing up the river at terrifying speed, sweeping away ships, docks, and hundreds who had sought refuge on the waterfront. A second and third wave followed, turning the harbor into a graveyard of broken masts and floating corpses. The collapse did not end with the quake. It accelerated through fire and water, erasing entire districts in a single afternoon. Human consequences unfolded with merciless speed. Between 30 and 40,000 souls perished in Lisbon alone, crushed under falling stone, burned alive in the hospital wards, or drowned in the surging river. The royal family escaped to the hills of Judah, where the king would develop a lifelong terror of closed spaces and order tents erected for the court. Corpses piled in the streets, threatening disease, while looters picked through the ruins, until the army erected gallows and executed more than 30 men as public examples. Pombal, taking charge with ruthless efficiency, issued the start command: bury the dead and heal the living. Soldiers pressed survivors into forced labor, clearing debris day and night. Social breakdown was total. Rich and poor alike wandered the smoking wasteland, faith shattered as churches that had promised salvation now lay open to the sky like broken teeth. In the weeks that followed, the old order fractured beyond repair. Aristocrats plotted against Pombal's growing power, while the church struggled to explain why God had chosen All Saints' Day to destroy his own houses of worship. Yet out of the ashes emerged the first stirrings of modern governance. Pombal launched Europe's first systematic scientific inquiry into the disaster, sending questionnaires to every parish asking for precise details of timing, direction of shocks, sea behavior, and casualties. His engineers razed the ruined Baisha and designed a new grid of wide avenues and earthquake-resistant buildings, the famous Gaiola Pombalina wooden frames that would flex rather than shatter. The reconstruction became a laboratory for disaster planning, but the human cost lingered in orphans sheltered by the later founded Casa Pia, and in the economic blow that consumed nearly half the nation's annual GDP. The long-term historical impact reached far beyond Portugal's borders. The earthquake shattered the philosophical optimism of the age, inspiring Voltaire's blistering Poems sur le désastre de Lisbonne, and his satire in Candide, where the philosopher Pangloss's claim that this was the best of all possible worlds rang hollow amid descriptions of the ruined city. Rousseau debated urban planning and natural living, while Immanuel Kant published early scientific treatises theorizing subterranean gases and cavern collapses. For the first time, a major European disaster was studied not as divine punishment, but as a natural phenomenon, giving birth to modern seismology and earthquake engineering. The Portuguese Empire, already strained, never fully recovered its former confidence. Political tensions boiled over into the 1758 Tavora affair, where Pombal used the chaos to crush aristocratic opposition and centralize power. Centuries later, the ruins of the Carmel convent still stand open to the Lisbon sky as a silent monument to that irreversible rupture. The quake that leveled a golden city did more than destroy stone and lives. It dismantled an entire worldview. Where once faith and empire had promised permanence, science and rational planning stepped forward to manage an unpredictable planet. Yet the lesson remains haunting. Civilizations rise on foundations they believe eternal, only to discover that the ground itself can betray them without warning. The 1755 Lisbon earthquake did not merely collapse buildings, it dismantled an entire worldview. It collapsed certainties that had guided Europe for generations, forcing humanity to confront its fragility in a way that still echoes through every modern disaster response, every seismic code, and every philosophical debate about suffering and progress. Today, when the earth trembles anywhere on the globe, the shadow of Lisbon falls across our preparations. We map faults, reinforce structures, and debate theodicy in new forms, yet the same questions linger in the silence after the shaking stops. What does it mean when the world we trust turns against us in an instant? The collapse of 1755 reminds us that history is not a steady march of progress, but a series of ruptures, some natural, some man-made, that force us to rebuild not just cities, but the very ideas we live by. In the end, the most enduring legacy of that fateful November morning is not the rebuilt Baisha with its elegant squares, but the quiet, unsettling knowledge that no empire, no faith, no civilization is ever truly safe from the ground beneath its feet. And somewhere, deep in the Atlantic, the fault line still waits, patient and indifferent, for the next moment when everything changes again.